Hello, I'm Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis, professor of psychology at Pepperdine University and an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I want to talk to you briefly about being a trauma-informed congregation and a trauma-informed minister. It's important to consider that not only are you caring for members, congregants, who are going through multiple traumas, but that you yourself are living through it. And so it's so important for us to take a moment for collective breath and what I like to call sacred pause as we center in not just learning what we can do for others, but how this applies to ourselves. So we want to differentiate stress from traumatic stress. Stress are those everyday experiences that you and your members deal with. We all have multiple roles and responsibilities. We figure out how to juggle it. And then there are events, and sometimes those are extended events that are disruptive to our way of coping, our way of meeting, our way of worshiping. They can shift our sense of the norm, our sense of our own identity. They can make it difficult for us to regulate our emotions. And so with that, we think of traumatic stress, those events that overwhelm our usual way of functioning. And in our current context, we can think about the traumas of COVID-19, which would fall under the array of medical trauma, but we also have the realities of societal trauma, which is oppression. So many of us are seeing in the news or in our own lives the reality of racism as a trauma. Many people have been laid off and may be experiencing the trauma of poverty. And so with all of these disruptions, how can we respond in a trauma-informed way? The first thing about being a trauma-informed congregation is to actually name and acknowledge the traumas. You may be surprised that many of our churches think to be relevant for God is to be decontextualized, to never speak about the things that are happening around our congregation and to us. But we know that our transparency, our truth-telling is what makes our ministry really impactful and causes us to follow the model of Jesus Christ, who never ignored context, situation, stress, or trauma, but responded to it. And so we as a congregation begin to acknowledge the traumas that our congregation is experiencing, and we acknowledge the impact of trauma. And so we will not be so startled or harsh on ourselves or others when we recognize that going through a trauma can create depression, anxiety, panic. It can create insomnia. People can turn to food to cope. They may find worship not as enjoyable as it was before. The things that used to be pleasurable aren't pleasurable anymore. And so it's important that we remove the myth that says, if I'm a person of faith, that I will not be affected or distressed. We know that's not biblical, that Jesus wept, and we see many of the great prophets were wailing and weeping prophets. And so we create space and compassion for those who are having a hard time, including ourselves. We also know that some people, instead of depression, traditional depression, that it will show up with irritability. Some people call that a bad attitude. It can also show up in terms of being distrusting. Some people are turning more to alcohol or other substances to soothe their distress. And so in our congregations, we acknowledge the trauma, we acknowledge the impact, and then we recognize the healing aspect of relationship. For us to be a flourishing or a thriving congregation, it is for us to be relational, to check on each other, and to start being transparent by not just talking in code. How are you? I'm blessed. How are you? I'm highly favored. And the truth is we can be blessed and stressed. The truth is I can be highly favored by the Lord and God loves me and I still have panic attacks. And so we began to cultivate authentic relationships where truth is present. And then we make the gospel relevant to those of us who are going through a very difficult time. And I was taught as I was going through seminary that many churches now have a praise team, but what we need is a lamentation team for people to know that even when they are burdened, even when they are sorrowful, especially when they are sorrowful, that this is a place for them. And so Maya Angelou wrote these words: Surviving is necessary, but thriving is elegant. And so it's important that as a church we survive, but it is also important to thrive, and to flourish means to recognize our wounds and know that trauma affects us, but it does not define us. In the midst of the storm, God is present.